Welcome to Sleep Gently, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favourite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep, to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, carried by the regular post through roads already dusted with the season's first snow. It was distinguished from ordinary correspondence only by the quality of its paper and the precision of its script. Margaret Ashwood, proprietor of the Riverside Inn for nearly 30 years, turned it over in her hands twice before opening it, as though the weight of the envelope itself might reveal its contents. She stood in the inn's small office, a room tucked behind the main desk where ledgers and correspondence lived in careful organisation. Morning light filtered through a single window, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. Outside, the river that gave the inn its name moved steadily past, its surface dark against the white banks, reflecting the heavy grey sky that promised more snow to come. Margaret broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The words were formal, written in a hand that spoke of education and careful attention. It was from a solicitor in London, a Mr. Edmund Graves, and it concerned a matter of some delicacy. She read it once, then again more slowly, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise to something more complex. The letter informed her that a former guest of the inn, a gentleman named Charles Whitmore, had passed away 3 months prior. Mr. Whitmore had been a regular visitor to the Riverside Inn over the course of many years, always staying in the same room, always keeping largely to himself. Margaret remembered him well, a quiet man of perhaps 60, who had seemed to carry some private sorrow, but had always been unfailingly courteous to staff and fellow guests alike. What made the letter remarkable was its second paragraph. Mr. Whitmore had left instructions in his will, specific instructions concerning the Riverside Inn and its proprietor. He had established a sum of money, to be held in trust, with particular conditions attached to its use. The money was substantial, enough to undertake significant repairs or improvements to the inn. But there was a task that must be completed first. Margaret was to locate and bring together 3 specific individuals, all of whom had stayed at the inn during Mr. Whitmore's various visits. She was to invite them to return for a particular weekend in December, precisely 1 month from the date of the letter. She was to provide accommodation and meals at no cost to these guests. And on the evening of their gathering she was to open a sealed packet that would be delivered separately, containing further instructions. The 3 individuals were named in the letter: Miss Eleanor Hartley, who had stayed at the inn in the spring of 1893, Dr. Robert Fenimore, a guest from the autumn of 1895, and Mr. James Wickham, who had visited during the winter of 1897. Margaret was provided with last known addresses for each, though the solicitor noted that some information might be outdated and that locating these individuals might require considerable effort. The letter concluded with a phrase that lingered in Margaret's mind long after she had finished reading. Mr. Whitmore believed that certain debts of kindness must be repaid, and certain truths must be spoken, even from beyond the grave. He trusted you, Mrs. Ashwood, to see this task completed with the discretion and care for which your establishment is known. Margaret set the letter down on her desk and moved to the window. Snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting past the glass. The river continued its steady flow, though ice was forming along its edges, creeping inward as winter tightened its grip. A small boat passed, its oars dipping rhythmically into the dark water, the rower bundled against the cold. She thought of Mr. Whitmore, of his quiet presence in her inn over the years, of conversations they had shared that were pleasant but never deeply personal. What had he been planning? What truths needed to be spoken? She returned to the letter and read the names again. Miss Eleanor Hartley, Dr. Robert Fenimore, Mr. James Wickham. The names stirred memories, vague impressions of faces and brief interactions. The inn hosted so many guests over the years, each staying for a night or a week before continuing their journeys. Some remained distinct in memory, others blurred together into a general impression of travellers and their needs. But these three, she would need to remember them clearly. She would need to search through old registers, through years of careful record-keeping, to find the details that might help her locate them. And she would need to do it within a month, in time for the gathering Mr. Whitmore had arranged from beyond death itself. Margaret took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. She'd managed an inn through wars and economic troubles, through harsh winters and difficult guests. She'd learned to solve problems, to persist when things became complicated. This task, unusual as it was, would simply require the same qualities she brought to her daily work: patience, attention to detail, and a determination to see things through properly. She pulled the inn's registers from the shelf where they lived, heavy leather-bound books that chronicled every guest who had signed in over the decades. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and steady, blanketing the world in white. She found the volume for 1893 and began turning pages, searching for spring, searching for the name Eleanor Hartley. The work of searching through old registers took Margaret the better part of 2 days. She worked in the early mornings before the inn's daily routines demanded her attention, and late into the evenings after the dinner service had concluded and guests had retired to their rooms. Her assistant, a capable young woman named Sarah, managed the front desk during these hours, allowing Margaret to focus on her unusual task. Outside, the weather had turned decisively toward winter. Snow fell almost continuously, accumulating in the courtyard, weighing down the branches of trees, transforming the familiar landscape into something both beautiful and severe. The inn's fires burned constantly, their warmth a necessary bulwark against the deepening cold. The registers revealed their secrets slowly. Each entry was a small window into the past, a name, a date of arrival and departure, occasionally a notation about particular requests or circumstances. Margaret found herself drawn into these fragments of history, remembering seasons and events she had not thought about in years. Miss Eleanor Hartley had stayed at the inn for 5 nights in April of 1893. The register showed her arriving alone, giving an address in Bath. Margaret had noted in her careful script that Miss Hartley had requested a room with a writing desk, and had taken most of her meals in her room rather than the dining room. A quiet guest then, someone seeking privacy or perhaps recovering from some difficulty. Margaret searched her memory for a face to match the name. Gradually an image emerged. A woman of perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back severely, and eyes that held a deep sadness. She had been polite but distant, declining invitations to join other guests in the parlour. Margaret remembered bringing tea to her room once, and noticing papers spread across the desk, closely written pages that Miss Hartley had quickly covered when the door opened. The address in Bath was old now, more than a decade past. Would Miss Hartley still be there? Margaret copied the information carefully into a fresh notebook, adding her own recollections beneath the formal details. She would write to the Bath address, but she would also need to think of other ways to trace the woman if that first attempt failed. Dr. Robert Fenimore proved easier to locate in the registers. He had stayed at the inn for a week in October of 1895, arriving from London and noting in conversation that he was taking a brief holiday before returning to his practice. Margaret remembered him more clearly, a man of about 40 with kind eyes and gentle manners. He had been interested in the local area, taking long walks along the river and into the countryside, his coat collar turned up against the autumn chill. He had struck up friendships easily with other guests, his medical knowledge making him a valuable conversational partner on various topics. The register provided a London address, a street in a respectable neighbourhood where many physicians maintain their practices. Margaret felt more hopeful about locating Dr. Fenimore. Medical directories existed, and doctors were generally easier to trace than private individuals. She made her notes and moved on to the third name. Mr. James Wickham had stayed at the inn for 3 nights in January of 1897, less than 2 years ago during a particularly harsh cold snap. Margaret's memory of him was clearer still. A young man, no more than 30, with an intensity about him that suggested he carried heavy concerns. He'd been travelling on business, something to do with investments or property, though he had not been specific. What Margaret remembered most clearly was finding him one evening in the parlour, staring into the fire with an expression of such profound worry that she had asked if he was well. He had assured her that he was simply working through a difficult decision. She had not pressed further, respecting his privacy, but she had made sure to leave a pot of tea and some biscuits within his reach. The next morning he had seemed lighter, more settled, and had thanked her warmly for the hospitality before departing into a world white with fresh snow. The register showed an address in Manchester. Again, the information was not current, but it was a starting point. Margaret closed the final register and surveyed her notes. 3 names, 3 addresses, 3 people whose lives had intersected briefly with Mr. Whitmore's at her inn. Now she needed to find them and bring them back together. She began with letters. That same afternoon, as snow continued to fall outside her window, she composed 3 careful messages, each slightly different but all conveying the same essential information. She explained that she was writing on behalf of the late Charles Whitmore, that a matter of some importance required their presence at the Riverside Inn for a weekend in December, and that all expenses would be covered. She tried to strike a tone that was neither too mysterious nor too mundane, that would convey urgency without causing alarm. The letters were posted the following morning. Sarah bundled herself against the cold and made the trek to the village post office, returning with snow clinging to her cloak and ice crystals in her hair. And then began the waiting, punctuated by Margaret's daily responsibilities at the inn. Guests arrived and departed, though fewer now as winter tightened its grip on the countryside. Meals were served, fires were lit and kept burning, beds were made with extra blankets against the cold. The ordinary rhythm of the inn continued, but underneath it ran a current of anticipation and uncertainty. 4 days later, the first reply arrived. It was from Dr. Fenimore, written in a clear, confident hand. He remembered his stay at the Riverside Inn with pleasure, and recalled meeting Mr. Whitmore briefly in the parlour one evening. He was intrigued by Margaret's letter, and, as it happened, had some flexibility in his schedule. He would be honoured to accept the invitation and looked forward to learning more about the matter when he arrived. He added a postscript noting that he hoped the roads would remain passable, as reports suggested a harsh winter ahead. Margaret felt a surge of relief. One found, two to go. She wrote back immediately, confirming the dates and providing details about his accommodation. She also assured him that the inn would be prepared for winter travel, with fires burning and warm meals waiting, whatever the weather might bring. The second reply took longer. Nearly 2 weeks passed, weeks during which snow fell almost daily, building deep drifts along the roads and testing the resolve of travellers. The inn took on the quality of a refuge, a warm island in a cold sea, and those guests who did arrive spoke gratefully of the fires and hot food after journeys through bitter wind and driving snow. Finally, an envelope arrived bearing a Bath postmark. It was not from Miss Hartley herself, but from her sister, a Mrs. Florence Bennet. The letter explained that Eleanor Hartley had passed away 4 years earlier, in 1895, from an illness that had troubled her for some time. Mrs. Bennet had been sorting through her late sister's effects when Margaret's letter arrived at the old address, forwarded by the current residents through several hands before reaching her. Margaret read the letter twice, feeling the weight of disappointment settle over her like the snow outside. She had not anticipated that one of the three might be deceased. What did this mean for Mr. Whitmore's instructions? Should she try to proceed with only 2 of the 3 guests? She set the letter aside, deciding to wait until she heard from Mr. Wickham before determining her next steps. But no letter came from Manchester. Weeks passed, and the deadline drew closer. The snow showed no signs of relenting. Each morning brought fresh accumulation, and the inn staff worked constantly to keep paths clear and ensure that wood supplies remained adequate for the many fires required to maintain warmth. Margaret sent a second letter to the Manchester address, then a third, each time wondering if perhaps Mr. Wickham had moved, or if her messages were simply not reaching him through the uncertain winter post. She made inquiries through business directories, but James Wickham was not an uncommon name, and without more specific information, her searches led nowhere. The snow continued to fall day after day, transforming the world into an endless expanse of white, broken only by the dark line of the river and the warm glow of the inn's windows. 10 days before the scheduled gathering, Margaret sat in her office and confronted the situation honestly. Outside, wind drove snow against the windows in gusts that rattled the glass. She had located one of the 3 guests successfully. One was deceased, and one remained frustratingly out of reach. By the terms of the solicitor's letter, she was meant to bring all 3 together, but that seemed increasingly impossible, particularly with winter making travel so difficult. She considered writing to Mr. Graves, the solicitor, to explain the difficulties and perhaps request a postponement until spring. But something made her hesitate. Mr. Whitmore had trusted her with this task. He had believed she could accomplish it. Perhaps there was a reason for his faith, some resource she had, not yet considered. That evening, as she served dinner to the inn's current guests, a small group huddled gratefully around the dining room fire, Margaret found herself studying their faces, listening to their conversations. The inn had always been a place where people's paths crossed, where strangers became temporary companions. Information flowed through such places, carried by travellers from distant cities and towns, even in winter. She approached a merchant who was dining alone, a regular guest who travelled frequently between London and the northern cities despite the season. In the course of casual conversation, she mentioned that she was trying to locate someone who had last been known to live in Manchester, a Mr. James Wickham, who had some connection to property or investments. The merchant, warming his hands around a mug of mulled wine, considered this thoughtfully. "Wickham, you say? There's a firm in Manchester. Wickham and Sons. They handle commercial properties. Could be your man. Or a relation, perhaps. They've been expanding despite the economic troubles. Good reputation for fair dealing." Margaret felt hope kindle again, a small flame against the cold. The next morning, despite the heavy snow that had fallen overnight, she composed another letter, this one addressed to Wickham and Sons in Manchester, marking it for the personal attention of Mr. James Wickham. She explained her purpose more fully this time, including Mr. Whitmore's name prominently, hoping it might stir recognition and response. Sarah made the difficult journey to the post office, returning hours later exhausted but successful. 3 days later, as Margaret was beginning to lose hope entirely, a telegram arrived. The telegraph boy had struggled through deep snow to deliver it, and Margaret pressed a generous tip into his cold hands before tearing open the message. It was brief, but welcome. "Received your letter. Stop, remember Riverside Inn, fondly stop. Will attend despite weather stop." Wickham! Margaret stood in her office holding the telegram and allowed herself a moment of profound relief. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside, by the warm fire, she had succeeded. She had done it. Against considerable odds, against winter itself, she had located 2 of the 3 people Mr. Whitmore had named. That Miss Hartley could not be present was unfortunate, but it was beyond anyone's control. Surely this would satisfy the terms of the bequest. She sent confirmations to both Dr. Fenimore and Mr. Wickham, providing final details and assuring them that whatever the weather, the inn would be ready to receive them. She included practical information about winter travel, suggested routes that might be more passable, and promised that hot meals and warm rooms would be waiting. The inn prepared for the special guests as it might prepare for any important occasion, but with extra attention to the challenges of winter. Rooms were selected and readied with particular care. Margaret chose her 2 best chambers, both overlooking the river, both furnished with the comfort and quiet that guests appreciated. Extra wood was stacked near the fireplaces. Additional blankets were placed at the foot of each bed. The parlour was cleaned thoroughly, its fire built to burn long and hot. The cook was consulted about menus, with instructions to prepare meals of particular quality and substance, the kind of food that would warm travellers who had braved winter roads. Sarah and the other staff polished brass, cleaned windows, and ensured that every lamp was filled and ready. The entire inn took on an air of anticipation, preparing to offer not just shelter, but true refuge from the storm. The second packet from the solicitor arrived 2 days before the scheduled gathering, delivered by special courier who'd been paid handsomely to ensure its safe arrival despite the weather. It was larger than a letter, sealed with wax, and marked clearly with instructions. To be opened on Saturday evening, December 14th, 1899, in the presence of the assembled guests. Margaret placed it in her office safe, where it seemed to emanate mystery and significance. Friday afternoon arrived with clear skies for the first time in weeks, though the cold was intense, turning breath to fog and making the snow crunch sharply underfoot. Margaret ensured that fires were burning in every room, that lamps were lit along the entrance path, that snow had been cleared from the courtyard and steps. Everything spoke of welcome and warmth, a beacon against the winter landscape. Dr. Fenimore arrived first, just as twilight was beginning to deepen the blue shadows on the snow. He stepped down from a hired carriage, the driver grateful for the promise of a warm stable for his horse and hot food for himself. The doctor was much as Margaret remembered, though his hair showed more grey now, and his face bore the lines that came with age and the weight of medical practice, but his eyes were kind, and he greeted Margaret warmly, his breath misting in the cold air. "Mrs. Ashwood, how good to see you again. I confess the journey was more challenging than I anticipated, but the sight of your inn with its lights burning makes it all worthwhile." "Dr. Fenimore, you're most welcome. Come inside quickly now before the cold claims you. Your room is ready and dinner will be served at 7. Mr. Wickham is expected this evening as well, so you'll have time to settle in and warm yourself." She ushered him into the entrance hall where the contrast between the bitter cold outside and the warmth within was almost shocking. Sarah appeared to take his snow-covered coat and hat, and Margaret personally showed him to his room, pointing out the amenities and ensuring he had everything he needed. When she left him, he was standing at the window, looking out at the snow-covered river, a slight smile on his face as though the view, despite the cold, brought back pleasant memories. Mr. Wickham arrived 2 hours later, having travelled by private carriage equipped for winter conditions. He stepped into the entrance hall and paused, his eyes moving around the space with clear recognition even as he stamped snow from his boots. He was older than Margaret remembered, closer to 35 now, and success had marked him. His clothes were well tailored, his bearing confident. But when he saw Margaret, his expression softened into something more genuine. "Mrs. Ashwood, I cannot tell you how strange it felt to receive your letter. I have thought of this place many times over the years, particularly during winter. The memory of its warmth sustained me through some difficult times. I'm glad you're able to come, Mr. Wickham. The roads must have been treacherous." They were indeed. But when you mentioned Charles Whitmore's name, I knew I had to make the attempt. I met him only once, on my last evening here during another snowy night much like this one. Our conversation, well, it changed some things for me. Changed everything, really. Margaret nodded, filing this information away. So Mr. Wickham and Mr. Whitmore had spoken, had formed some connection during their overlapping time at the inn. This seemed significant, though she did not yet understand how. She showed Mr. Wickham to his room, and then descended to make final preparations for dinner. The cook had prepared a substantial winter meal, roasted beef with root vegetables, followed by steamed pudding with brandy sauce. Wine had been mulled with spices. The dining room had been set with care. 3 places arranged at one end of the long table to encourage intimate conversation, with candles providing warm light and the fire crackling steadily in the hearth. When the 2 guests descended and entered the dining room, there was a moment of awkwardness. 2 strangers brought together by mysterious circumstances, their only common bond a man neither had known well. But Margaret had long experience in facilitating such moments. She made introductions, poured the hot-spiced wine, and guided the conversation through safe channels until the men found their own rhythm. Dr. Fenimore, it emerged, had maintained his practice in London, but had recently taken on a partner, allowing him more freedom to travel and pursue research interests, though winter travel was a new challenge for him. Mr. Wickham had indeed built a successful property firm, expanding well beyond his initial ventures. Both men were unmarried. Both spoke of their work with passion, but also with a certain wistfulness. as though success had come at costs they were only beginning to recognise. As dinner progressed, and the wine warmed them from within, while the fire warmed them from without, conversation turned inevitably to Charles Whitmore. Margaret encouraged this, hoping to understand more about the man whose death had set all of this in motion. "I met him in the parlour," Dr. Fenimore recalled, gazing into his wine. "It was my third evening here, I think. October, a beautiful autumn evening with leaves falling outside these very windows. I had been reading, and he was sitting by the fire. We began talking about books, and then about life more generally. He had a way of listening that made you want to speak honestly. I found myself telling him things I had not articulated even to myself." "What sort of things?" Margaret asked gently. Dr. Fenimore considered, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "I was struggling at that time with whether I had chosen the right path. I had become a doctor to help people, but I found myself increasingly caught up in the business aspects of practice, in maintaining appearances and social connections. I felt I had lost sight of my original purpose." Mr. Whitmore listened to all of this, and then he asked me a simple question. He asked what I would do if success and money were not considerations, if I could structure my life purely around what mattered most to me. And did you have an answer? Not immediately, but the question stayed with me, followed me back to London and through the years since. Over time I made changes. I began taking on more charity patients. I became involved in research that interested me regardless of its financial promise. I like to think I found my way back to my original purpose, or at least closer to it. Mr. Wickham had been listening intently, watching the firelight play across his wine. Now he spoke quietly. He asked me a similar question. I met him on my last evening here during a winter night much like this one. The inn was full of travellers sheltering from a storm. I'd been wrestling with a business decision for weeks, whether to pursue an opportunity that would be very profitable, but would require methods I was not entirely comfortable with, practices that were legal, but perhaps not entirely ethical. Mr. Whitmore and I spoke for several hours, right here in this dining room after everyone else had retired. He did not tell me what to do, but he helped me see clearly what the choice really involved, what I would be sacrificing if I took that path. Not just my integrity, but my peace of mind, my ability to look at myself honestly in the mirror each morning. "And what did you decide?" Margaret asked. "I walked away from that opportunity. It cost me considerably in the short term. Some investors withdrew their support, thinking me naive or foolish. But I built my business differently, on a foundation I could be proud of. I have never regretted that decision. The firm prospered eventually, and more importantly, I can sleep at night knowing that every property we manage is held to standards I believe in." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of these revelations settling over the table like the snow settling over the landscape outside. The fire crackled, wind pressed against the windows, the inn held them safe and warm while winter surrounded them. Then, Doctor, Fenimore turned to Margaret with a questioning look. "You mentioned in your letter that there was a third person who was meant to be here, a Miss Hartley?" Margaret nodded, her expression growing sombre. "Yes. Unfortunately, I learnt that Miss Hartley passed away several years ago in 1895. I was only able to locate the two of you. Her sister wrote to me, but beyond confirming Eleanor's death, she could share little about her circumstances." "Eleanor Hartley," Mr. Wickham said suddenly, sitting forward. "That name. Yes, I remember her now. There was a woman staying here when I was a guest. I never spoke with her directly, but I saw her once or twice. She seemed very solitary, very sad. I remember seeing her through a doorway, standing at a window watching snowfall much like tonight. Something in her posture spoke of such loneliness that it stayed with me. That matches my memory of her, Margaret confirmed. She kept largely to herself during her stay. She seemed to be working through some private struggle. I wish I knew what connection she had to Mr. Whitmore, or why he wanted her to be part of this gathering. I feel I have failed in that part of his request. Dr. Fenimore shook his head gently. You could not bring back the dead, Mrs. Ashwood. You've done everything possible. Perhaps Mr. Whitmore knew the risk, but hoped anyway. Hope, after all, costs nothing. Perhaps, Margaret agreed. Tomorrow's revelations may clarify that. Gentlemen, do you have any sense of what might be in the packet we're meant to open? Both men shook their heads. Mr. Wickham refilled their wineglasses from the warm decanter. None at all. But I find myself both eager and apprehensive to learn. Mr. Whitmore clearly planned this with great care. Whatever he wished to share, it mattered deeply to him. They finished dinner in contemplative mood, and then retired to the parlour where a fire burned so hot that the room felt almost too warm, a welcome excess after the bitter, cold outside. Margaret served coffee and brandy, and the conversation turned to lighter topics, memories of travels, observations about how the world was changing as the century drew toward its close. But underneath the pleasant talk, anticipation hummed quietly, a shared awareness that tomorrow evening would bring answers to questions they had not known they were carrying. Outside, snow began falling again, heavy flakes drifting past the windows, adding to the deep drifts already accumulated. The inn stood firm against the storm, its lights burning steady, smoke rising from its chimneys in thin columns before being caught and scattered by the wind. Inside, 3 people sat together in warmth and safety, waiting for truth to be revealed. Saturday morning dawned with weak sunlight struggling through heavy clouds. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world transformed. Snow lay deep everywhere, sculpted by wind into smooth curves and sharp edges, beautiful and severe. Margaret rose early, as was her habit, and found both guests already awake. Dr. Fenimore sitting in the parlour with a book and hot tea, Mr. Wickham standing at a window, watching the pale light strengthen on the snow. Breakfast was a substantial affair. Porridge thick and sweet, eggs and bacon, fresh bread still warm from the oven, eaten at a leisurely pace while wind rattled the windows and the fire crackled. Afterward, Margaret suggested that her guests might enjoy a brief walk if they were properly dressed, that the air was bitter but the landscape beautiful after the storm. Both men seemed grateful for this suggestion, perhaps needing time alone with their thoughts before the evening's gathering. Dr. Fenimore bundled himself in layers and set out along the cleared path that followed the river upstream, his footprints dark in the fresh snow. Mr. Wickham borrowed an extra coat and walked toward the village, though he did not go far before the deep snow and cutting wind turned him back toward the inn's warmth. Margaret watched them both depart and return, then turned her attention to the inn's normal operations and the special preparations for the evening ahead. The afternoon passed slowly, time seeming to stretch in the way it does when anticipation builds. Guests returned for a late lunch, both seeming refreshed by their excursions despite the cold, their cheeks red and their eyes bright. The sky began to darken early, as winter afternoons do, and lamps were lit throughout the inn. Margaret had arranged for an early dinner, simple but perfectly prepared, so that they could move to the parlour afterward with sufficient time and comfort for whatever revelations awaited. As they finished their meal, Margaret felt her heart begin to beat faster. Outside, snow had begun falling again, soft and silent. This was the moment everything had been building toward. She excused herself briefly and went to her office, retrieving the sealed packet from the safe. It was heavier than she expected, substantial. She carried it carefully back to the parlour, where both men had settled near the fire, their faces reflecting curiosity and something else, perhaps nervousness, or hope, or both. "Gentlemen," Margaret said, taking a seat where she could see both of them clearly, "I believe it's time." She looked down at the packet, at Mr. Whitmore's name written on it, in the solicitor's precise hand. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. She broke the seal and opened it. Inside were several items. First, a letter addressed to all of them, written in what must have been Mr. Whitmore's own hand, elegant but slightly shaky. The writing of someone who knew his time was limited. Second, a small leather journal, its pages worn soft with handling. Third, 3 separate sealed envelopes, each bearing a name: Dr. Robert Fenimore, Mr. James Wickham, Miss Eleanor Hartley. Margaret withdrew the main letter first, and with a glance at the 2 men to ensure they were ready, began to read aloud. Her voice was steady despite the motion she felt building. To Mrs. Margaret Ashwood, Dr. Robert Fenimore, Mr. James Wickham, and Miss Eleanor Hartley. If you are reading this, then I have passed from this world, and Mrs. Ashwood has succeeded in the task I set for her. I thank you, Margaret, for your effort and care. I knew I could trust you to see this through, even if winter made the task more difficult. Your inn has always been a place of refuge, and you have always been its heart. To those gathered, I owe you an explanation. During the final years of my life, I stayed regularly at the Riverside Inn. These visits were not mere holidays or escapes. They were deliberate pilgrimages to a place that had become, for me, a kind of sanctuary. I came seeking peace, or perhaps understanding, regarding failures and regrets that had accumulated over a lifetime of choices made poorly or not at all. Each of you, during your own stays at the inn, spoke with me. Perhaps you remember these conversations, perhaps not, but I remember them. I remember every word, every hesitation, every moment when I saw you standing at a crossroads, facing a decision that would shape the rest of your life. Each of you was facing a crucial moment when your path might turn one way or another. I saw in each of you something I had lacked at similar moments in my own life: the courage to examine yourselves honestly, to question whether the path you were on was truly the one you wished to walk. I could not help my younger self. That opportunity was long past, but I found I could offer what small wisdom I had gained to others standing at their own crossroads. I asked questions, I listened, and in a few cases I like to believe I helped, if only by providing a sounding board for thoughts that needed to be spoken aloud. This gathering is my attempt to close a circle, to see whether the seeds planted in those conversations bore fruit. Dr. Fenimore, I hoped you would find your way back to medicine as a calling rather than merely a career. Mr. Wickham, I hoped you would choose integrity over expedience, even when the cost was high. Miss Hartley, I hoped you would find the courage to speak a truth that had been locked inside you for too long, to break free from chains that bound you to misery. The journal I have included contains my own story, the full story I never shared with any of you. I ask that you read it, that you understand where my small bits of wisdom came from. They were bought at considerable price, paid in years of regret and isolation. The sealed letters contain something personal for each of you, thoughts I wanted to share but could not while I lived. For Miss Hartley, if she cannot be present, perhaps her family might receive the letter, though its contents may be difficult. I have arranged for a substantial bequest to the Riverside Inn through my estate, in gratitude for the shelter and peace it provided me. Mrs. Ashwood, I hope this will serve the inn well in the years to come, allowing it to continue offering refuge to travellers who need it, especially in winter when the need is greatest. To all of you, I offer my thanks and my hope that life has treated you kindly since we last met. If this gathering takes place during winter, as I suspect it might, know that I chose December deliberately. Winter strips away pretense, reveals what is essential, shows us who we are when comfort and ease are removed. In winter we learn what truly matters. In winter, the warmth of human connection becomes not merely pleasant, but necessary. Charles Whitmore. Margaret lowered the letter slowly, her hands trembling slightly. The parlour was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Both men sat motionless, their faces reflecting complex emotions, surprise, recognition, perhaps grief for a man they had known only briefly but who had touched their lives in ways they were only now beginning to understand. Dr. Fenimore spoke first, his voice rough with feeling. I had no idea that our conversation meant anything to him, or that he was struggling with his own burdens while helping me with mine. He seemed like a man at peace, someone who had found answers I was still seeking. He gave no indication, Mr. Wickham agreed, his jaw tight. He seemed like someone offering wisdom from a place of certainty, not someone still searching for his own redemption. Margaret set the letter aside and picked up the journal. Snow continued to fall outside, each flake adding to the accumulated silence of winter. He wanted us to read this. Shall I? Both men nodded, leaning forward slightly, their attention absolute. Margaret opened the journal to the first page and began to read. The story that unfolded was one of accumulating regrets, of choices made for security rather than passion, of relationships sacrificed to ambition, of a life that had looked successful from outside but had felt increasingly hollow from within. Mr. Whitmore wrote with painful honesty about opportunities missed, about pride that had prevented reconciliation with family members now dead, about love unexpressed until it was too late to matter. He described a successful career in banking that had consumed his youth and middle years, leaving him wealthy but alone. He wrote of a woman he had loved but never proposed to, watching her eventually marry another while he focused on advancing his position. He wrote of estrangement from a younger brother over a petty disagreement, stubbornness preventing reconciliation until the brother's death made it impossible. But the journal was not entirely bleak. Its later pages described Mr. Whitmore's discovery of the Riverside Inn during a period of profound despair. He had come here initially by accident, seeking any shelter during an unexpected storm. What he found was more than physical refuge. He found in Margaret's quiet competence and genuine care, in the inn's atmosphere of safety and peace, a place where he could begin to examine his life honestly. He wrote about his decision to return regularly, to make the inn a kind of retreat where he could think clearly away from the demands and distractions of London. And he wrote about the conversations, including ones with Dr. Fenimore and Mr. Wickham, analysing what he had tried to offer and hoping desperately that it had been received in the spirit intended. One passage made Margaret's voice catch as she read it aloud. "Today I spoke with a young man facing a decision about his business practices. I saw in him the same crossroads I faced 30 years ago, when I chose profit over principle in a matter that seemed small, but set the pattern for all that followed. I could not tell him of my own failure directly, for what right had I to confess and burden him with my regrets? But I could ask questions, help him see clearly what he was really choosing. If he makes the better choice, the one I failed to make, then perhaps my mistakes will have purchased something of value after all. Perhaps the cost I paid will spare him the same price." Mr. Wickham made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Margaret paused, looking at him with concern, but he gestured for her to continue, though tears were running down his face. The journal's middle sections detailed other conversations, other guests Mr. Whitmore had encountered, and tried to help in small ways. Some had responded, some had not. Some he had watched make choices he approved of, others he had seen repeat his own mistakes despite his gentle interventions. He wrote philosophically about this, acknowledging that he could not save everyone, that each person must walk their own path, but still he tried. The entries about Miss Eleanor Hartley were particularly poignant. Mr. Whitmore had encountered her during one of his stays, had noticed her isolation and sadness. Through careful, respectful conversation, he had learned that she was trapped in a marriage that was destroying her spirit, that she felt she had no choice but to endure because leaving would mean social ruin and financial destitution. "I spoke with Miss Hartley for 3 hours one evening," the journal recorded. "I told her as directly as I dared that no social standing or financial security was worth the destruction of one's soul. I told her that I had sacrificed love and family for position and wealth, and that in my old age I would trade all my money for one genuine connection, one relationship not poisoned by calculation and pretense." She wept. She said she did not know if she had the courage to leave. I told her that courage was not the absence of fear, but action despite it. I do not know if my words helped. I can only hope. The final entry was dated just weeks before Mr. Whitmore's death. Margaret's voice grew softer as she read it, as though the words themselves were fragile. "I do not know if I have done enough to balance the ledger of my life. Perhaps no amount of late wisdom shared can compensate for wisdom ignored when it mattered most. But I find myself at peace with what I have tried to do. The Riverside Inn gave me sanctuary when I needed it most. Through Mrs. Ashwood's kindness and the chance encounters with fellow travellers, I found purpose in my final years. If this gathering takes place, if my words reach those I hope to help, then perhaps my life will have ended with something more than regret. Perhaps winter, which strips everything to essentials, will reveal that beneath all my failures there was still something of value. Perhaps even a wasted life can produce a small harvest if the final season is tended with care." Margaret closed the journal, tears streaming down her own face now. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow against the windows in swirling gusts. But inside, the fire burned steady and warm. Across from her, Dr. Fenimore had removed his spectacles and was wiping his eyes. Mr. Wickham stared into the fire, his face wet, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. After a long silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the wind's howl, Margaret reached for the sealed letters. She handed one to each man, then looked at the third, bearing Miss Eleanor Hartley's name. "Her sister provided an address," Margaret said quietly. I will send this to her tomorrow, though, as Mr. Whitmore noted, its contents may be difficult. The two men opened their letters and read in silence. Margaret waited, giving them privacy for whatever personal words Mr. Whitmore had left them. Outside, the storm intensified, but inside they were safe, held by walls that had sheltered travellers for generations. When they finished, both carefully folded the letters and tucked them away. There was a quality to their silence that suggested the words had struck deep. "He thanked me," Dr. Fenimore said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He said that our conversation had helped him as much as he hoped it helped me, that speaking his thoughts aloud to someone who was listening had brought clarity he had not expected. He said watching me wrestle with my questions had reminded him that the struggle itself was valuable, that doubt could be the beginning of wisdom rather than weakness." Mr. Wickham nodded slowly. "Mine was similar. He wrote that watching me work through that decision, seeing me choose the harder right over the easier wrong, had given him hope that perhaps the next generation would do better than his had done. He said he had lived to see at least some evidence that his life, wasted as it was, might still cast a small light forward. He thanked me for giving him that gift." Margaret stood and moved to the window, looking out at the storm. Snow fell so thickly now that she could barely see the river. Just a sense of darkness beyond the white chaos. He created this gathering to see the results of his efforts, to know whether his final years had mattered. And they did. You're both proof of that. Your lives, the choices you made, they mattered to him. They gave his life meaning when he feared it had none. Dr. Fenimore rose and joined her at the window. "But Miss Hartley, we still don't know her part in this. What truth was she meant to speak, and did she speak it before she died?" "I will write to her sister," Margaret said. "A proper letter this time, not just a brief inquiry. I will send the sealed letter and ask gently if she is willing to share anything about Eleanor's final years. Perhaps we will learn the rest of the story. Perhaps there is still hope, even for endings we think we know." The three of them stood together in the quiet parlour, connected now by invisible threads, by the life and death of Charles Whitmore, by the inn that had sheltered them all, by the recognition that small kindnesses and honest conversations could ripple forward through time in ways impossible to predict. Outside, winter raged. Inside, warmth held steady. They remained in the parlour for another hour, speaking quietly about Mr. Whitmore, about their own lives, about the strange gift they had been given in being brought together this way. The storm showed no signs of abating, and eventually Margaret suggested they retire. That morning might bring clearer weather and clearer thoughts. Sunday morning dawned bright and bitterly cold. The storm had passed, leaving the world transformed into a landscape of such pristine white beauty that it almost hurt to look at. The inn was nearly buried in snow, drifts reaching halfway up the ground floor windows, but the chimney still smoked, and inside, warmth and life continued. Both men departed late that morning after a substantial breakfast and many expressions of gratitude to Margaret. Dr. Fenimore promised to return for a visit in the spring. Mr. Wickham made a generous donation to the inn beyond what Mr. Whitmore's bequest had provided, saying it was the least he could do for a place that had given him so much. As their carriages pulled away, struggling through the deep snow, Margaret stood at the window and watched them go. Then she returned to her office and composed a careful letter to Mrs. Florence Bennet. 2 weeks later, as December drew toward Christmas and the world remained locked in winter's grip, a reply arrived. It was long and detailed, written with obvious emotion. Margaret read it by the fire in her private sitting room, and as she read, tears came again. Eleanor Hartley, Mrs. Bennet wrote, had been living a lie, trapped in a situation she could see no way to escape. Her husband was not physically violent, but he was cruel in subtler ways, controlling every aspect of her life, isolating her from family and friends, destroying her confidence and sense of self. During her stay at the Riverside Inn, she had been contemplating ending her own life, seeing no other escape from her misery. But she'd encountered Charles Whitmore. Their conversation, which Eleanor had later recounted to her sister in detail, had given her a different kind of courage. Not the courage to endure, which she had mistaken for virtue, but the courage to leave, to choose life and freedom over death or living death. She had left her husband within a month of returning from the inn. It had been devastating, just as she had feared. Society condemned her. She lost her position, her home, her social connections. But Mrs. Bennet had taken her in, and slowly, painfully, Eleanor had rebuilt a life on honest foundations. Her final years had been brief, cut short by the illness Mrs. Bennet had mentioned in her first letter. But they had been genuine years, lived according to her own values rather than others' expectations. She'd found work as a teacher, she had made true friends, she had known peace and even moments of joy. She'd often spoken of that stay at the inn as the turning point, the moment when she found strength she had not known she possessed, given to her by a kind stranger who had seen her suffering and cared enough to speak truth. "My sister died free," Mrs. Bennet wrote. "Whatever her other sufferings, she died as herself, not as the hollow shell she was becoming in that terrible marriage." Mr. Whitmore gave her that gift. Please, if you have any way to communicate with him or his memory, tell him that Eleanor's final words included gratitude for him. Tell him, she said, his kindness saved her life in the most literal sense. Margaret set the letter down and sat for a long time, watching the fire. Outside, children were playing in the snow, their laughter drifting through the cold air. The inn around her was quiet, peaceful, ready for the next travellers who would need its shelter. She thought about Charles Whitmore, about a life that had seemed wasted but had produced these small miracles. She thought about Dr. Fenimore finding his way back to his calling, about Mr. Wickham choosing integrity, about Eleanor Hartley choosing life. She thought about how the inn had been the place where these seeds were planted, how her work in maintaining this refuge had been part of something larger than she had realised. The solicitor's bequest had been generous, ensuring the inn's future security. But the real gift, Margaret understood now, was knowing that her life's work mattered, that providing shelter and warmth was not merely a business, but a sacred trust. People came to her inn carrying burdens, and sometimes, mysteriously, they left those burdens lighter or found strength to carry them better. She rose and moved through the inn, checking that all was in order, that fires were burning properly, that the kitchen was prepared for the evening meal. The work was the same as always, the endless tasks of maintaining a place of refuge. But she did them now, with deeper understanding, with gratitude for the privilege of this work. That evening, she wrote a final letter to Mr. Graves, the solicitor, confirming that Mr. Whitmore's wishes had been fulfilled as completely as possible. She described the gathering, the reading of the journal, the conversations that had followed. She included Mrs. Bennet's letter, asking that it be filed with Mr. Whitmore's papers as a testament to the impact of his final years. Christmas came, bringing more snow and more travellers seeking shelter and warmth. The inn filled with the sounds of children and laughter, with the scents of cooking and pine boughs, with the particular joy that comes from being safe and warm while winter rages outside. Margaret moved through these days with quiet satisfaction, knowing that every guest she welcomed, every fire she ensured was burning properly, every warm meal served, was part of a larger pattern of care that stretched back through generations and would continue forward. The riverside inn stood beside its flowing water, steady and constant, a place of refuge in a changing world, and within its walls the memory of Charles Whitmore lingered like a blessing, a reminder that it is never too late to matter, never too late to offer what wisdom we have gained, never too late to hope that our lives have counted for something beyond ourselves. Even a life that feels wasted can bear fruit in its final season if tended with honesty and care. Outside, the river continued its patient flow beneath sheets of ice, carrying its waters forward as it had for countless years, as it would for countless more. Snow fell and melted and fell again. Travellers came and went, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own moments of decision, and the inn waited, warm and welcoming, ready to shelter them all, ready to offer not just refuge from the storm, but perhaps, for those who needed it, a place where transformation could begin, where courage should be found, where truth could be spoken and heard. The fire burned on through the long winter nights, its light visible for miles across the snow, a beacon promising warmth and safety to all who sought it. And Margaret Ashwood, keeper of that flame, continued her work with renewed purpose, knowing now the full measure of what she'd been called to do. Sleep gently, dear listener. May you find your own sanctuary, your own place of rest and renewal. May you discover, as Charles Whitmore did, that it is never too late to plant seeds of kindness, never too late to speak truth that might help another soul find their way. And may you know in your deepest heart that even small acts of care and courage ripple forward through time in ways you may never fully see, but that matter more than you can imagine. The snow falls soft outside your window tonight. Inside you are warm and safe. Let that be enough. Let peace find you here in this quiet moment, sheltered from the storm. Sleep now and dream of light in darkness, of warmth in winter, of hope that persists even when all seems lost. Good night.